Hi folks, this is Tabiasobi, and today we're going to go through the hot topic that's blazing through the Monster Hunter community now that reviews are out, and that would be concerns on whether the game is too easy. Now, I happen to be one of those reviewers. I actually reviewed the game for the Reno Gazette Journal and USA Today Network, and so you can actually see my review at rgj.com if you're curious. I put a lot of my thoughts in that review. It's like 5,000 plus words. Yeah, I've been playing the game since Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, so I have a lot of thoughts about not just the game, but the series as a whole. So I just wanted to make sure I addressed everything I could think of, especially for the community. Now, I'm limited right now in terms of what I can talk about because the game's not out yet as of this recording, so I'll limit my comments to stuff that I could address without breaking the embargo. But for those of you who don't want to listen to a whole video about how easy the game is and what's going on, if you ask me if the game is easier or if the game is easy, then my answer would be yes. In fact, I mentioned that in my review, and I was actually surprised that it became such a theme in all the other reviews, because I don't know any of the other reviewers. The only person I talked to was my colleague who reviewed the game with me, and he thought the game was easy too. And then I met some of the reviewers from other outlets during play sessions at Capcom, but it's not like I ever got in touch with them after that, so it's not like all the reviewers got together and have this huge conspiracy about saying the game is easy. That being said, just saying the game is easy doesn't really address the whole story. And it's funny because I believe I had a video about this just a few months ago, and I haven't really been posting a lot because I've been busy with work. But I did share my thoughts on this issue in that video, and that was not the first video I've ever done or article about whether the game is too easy. But difficulty is certainly a subjective thing. So for folks such as myself who have been playing for years, very long time, my standard as to what is easy is going to be totally different from somebody who is new to the series. Now, yes, Monster Hunter Wilds felt easy. Like through the whole high rank campaign, I only used the first starter high rank armor that I crafted after low rank, and used that till Hunter rank 60 plus. And with that, I was actually able to fight every single monster in the game, really with no problems. And I could honestly still use that set right now, but I did decide to change to a new set just because I wanted to try something new. And I will say that the endgame set I'm using right now does have a lot more defense, which helps a lot, especially against tempered monsters, which is another thing that I can't really talk about, but they're there. And so I'm trying to remember the last time there was a Monster Hunter game where I was able to go through the whole high rank part of the game with just the very first starter high rank armor that I crafted. Because this might be the first one, though Rise might be the same. But usually, traditionally, I would craft one armor for low rank, and I don't really spend too much on armor in low rank because it's not like weapons where you can upgrade them. Once you get to high rank, the low rank armor is pretty much a dead end and you can't really upgrade it. And so after that, I'll pick one starter high rank armor that I work on, and then usually I'll change it maybe halfway or closer to the end of high rank, and then I'll use that second armor as my main farming armor for the real endgame armor. And so I didn't have to do that for this game. Although I must say I do love the Doshiguma mixed set that I was using. It's really good as far as survivability, and then the Doshiguma power or Doshiguma might bonus skill set that comes with it works really well with my preference for using offset attacks and clashes, because it gives you extra power when you successfully do those. Now, as far as the game being easy, I believe it's important to put some context into that. So yes, Monster Hunter Wilds felt easy to me overall. I mean, there were some situations that got a bit hairy when I was going against some of the tempered monsters, but overall, I felt the game was easier. Having said that, I will say that every base game of the Monster Hunter series also felt easy to me. The only exception was Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, because that was my first Monster Hunter game, and I had no clue what I was doing. So that was like my Monster Hunter baptism. But from Tri onward, all the games felt relatively easy for me. I thought Tri was relatively easy. I thought Monster Hunter 4 was easy. I felt World was easy. It actually got a lot easier for me with World because the controls got better and the camera got way better. And that was a big part of why that game felt easier for me. And then Rise also felt easy. Rise might actually be the easiest at that point. I used to say World, but now that I think about it, I thought Rise was easier, but the issue was that Rise wasn't a complete game when it launched because of COVID. And so there were a lot of things that were held back. And so it was always tricky judging the difficulty of that game, because do you judge it based on what it was when it launched, or do you judge it based on what it was after it got updated? So those games felt easy to me too. Now this is the funny thing. So from Try Onward all the way up to Rise and even Sunbreak, I don't remember ever carding in a Monster Hunter campaign. Like usually I start carding during the end game, especially once you get the really hard monsters coming in, like Elatrion or Fatalis, that type of stuff. So it's quite ironic that Monster Hunter Wilds, which at this point I consider probably the easiest game I've ever played campaign-wise for Monster Hunter, this is actually the first game where I actually carded during the campaign. And I'm trying to remember until what point I'm allowed to talk about monsters prior to the game coming out, so I'm hesitant to provide details. But the card happened during a fight against one specific monster that was able to cart me from full health because of one powerful attack. And I had no idea how to deal with that attack. I tried hiding behind a wall and it didn't work. So I got one shot pretty much. And then I eventually figured out how to deal with it. In fact, I'm going to do a video once the game is out on the 3 ways you could deal with this particular attack. But at the time I didn't know what was going on, I wasn't quite ready. And so I carded for the first time in a Monster Hunter campaign. In the game that is arguably for me the easiest campaign I've gone through so far. And like I said earlier, difficulty is in the eye of the beholder. So I could totally understand if somebody has been playing Monster Hunter for a long time and has a lot of experience, and then they say that this game is easier or too easy. Because once you've had enough experience with Monster Hunter, you kind of know how it works. It's easier to deal with what the monsters do, and so you're not just some clueless person who has no idea what's going on. Like sometimes when I don't play Monster Hunter for months, like the first couple of hunts could be a little bit rough as I try to sort of remember how things go. But then after like a couple of hunts, I'm usually pretty much back in the game and I start doing really good. Now in the previous video that I did about is Monster Hunter Wilds easy or Monster Hunter getting easy, one of the things I mentioned is that I felt a lot of the difficulty in the older games comes from the fact that the controls and camera were harder to deal with. This was especially true for bowgunners, and I actually started the game as a bowgun main. And so dealing with the camera, dealing with the claw, those were some challenges, and you kind of got used to them. But going back now, I honestly can't believe how I was able to deal with that. It was that rough, and I felt the monsters were slower, they don't track as well, but that also felt to be by design. Because I tell you now, if we fight the monsters that we have now, or even the ones in Sunbreak, using the old tanky controls, I betcha they're going to be harder than those monsters from the past games. Because those monsters in the past games were slower, like I said. Part of the challenge that they provided was because like the hitboxes would be janky, for example. And the game just didn't have the polish it has now in terms of how the monsters are designed and how they act. I mean, I still remember the hitbox from Plesios's hip check. I swear, that attack, you could clearly see that you dodged it, and you still get hit. And so part of the challenge or the difficulty in the past games pretty much involves how game design was back then and how you had limitations based on what was available at the time versus to what you have now. Like in Sunbreak, for example, the monster tracking is pretty wild. No pun intended. I mean, the monsters track you like a heat-seeking missile. It's one of the reasons I used to count Diablos as one of the monsters I used to struggle with when I started playing the game, because it was one of the monsters that was quick and was really good at tracking. But now it seems like every monster can track you pretty well. And that was one of the things I noticed when I was playing Sunbreak. And I could see why they did that, because that is the way you can deal with a lot of the quality of life changes that were added to the game that made the game easier. So the controls are better now, the hitboxes are better, and so as players you have a lot more tools to deal with monsters that you didn't have before. And so it makes sense that even if the monsters are faster now and track better, it can still feel like it's easier to deal with them than it was before. I will say this though, while the base games felt pretty easy to me overall, that changed once Master Rank came in, or G Rank if you're an old school player. So World was pretty easy, But then Iceborne came, and I swear some of the monsters in that game were like a nightmare to deal with, especially when you're not used to their patterns yet. I remember Elatrion being a pain, especially when you're playing with randoms. I usually prefer to play solo or with maybe like one partner. But given the amount of damage you had to inflict with Elatrion, so it was more like an MMO fight where you have to do a damage check pretty much, or pass a damage check. That was one of the things that made that hunt challenging, and I had to specifically gear up for it, while with other monsters I could pretty much use whatever, not worry too much, and usually pull through. And the Fatalis was also a challenge. Eventually you learn their patterns and you're able to deal with them better, but I remember those monsters being really difficult the first time I tried them. And so as far as Wilds is concerned, I don't really have huge concerns moving forward, because Capcom has a pretty good record of adding new monsters, including more challenging ones. And that will hold especially true with the Master Rank version or expansion when that comes out. Now, I will say some people might feel like they're being cheated on a difficult hunting experience just because the base game is easier. I know there are some folks who don't want to wait until the DLCs or the expansion to face tougher monsters. But having said that, I've always felt all the base games were really pretty easy to me. It wasn't until Master Rank or G Rank that the difficulty started to really kick in. And it's only with certain monsters too. And I thought that was funny, because I remember people complaining that World was too easy, and then all of a sudden people were complaining that Elatrion was too cheap. It's like, Elatrion is a totally different way to hunt. That's not what Monster Hunter is like. What are these damage mechanics that you have to fulfill? And in the case of Wilds, one of the reasons it felt easier was because you get even more tools than before. Like for this particular review that I did, I primarily played Greatsword and Heavy Bowgun, although I did try all the other weapons during the beta. And Greatsword especially got a lot of really good changes in Wilds that made the game a lot easier. Like, I still miss some of the mobility from Rise and Sunbreak, but the addition of the focus camera, for example, is a huge deal for Greatsword. Like, I used to expect to whiff a certain percentage of attacks, and with Wilds, thanks to the focus camera, I rarely miss at this point. It's like when I miss, it's almost surprising. I mean, it does happen, but it's pretty rare compared to before. So you got that, and then you also have this new wounding mechanic, and that also makes the game easier because it gives you extra chances to either flinch or stagger the monster, which really helps when they're all mad and you need some breathing room. You just pop up a wound, and then you're golden. Especially when you have a setup that's specifically geared towards being able to inflict more wounds. And so you got that, and then you got mounting, which started with Monster Hunter 4. What else? There's just so many things that you can do now to either hold a monster in place or flinch them. Like the offset attacks, for example, in the Clash. Oh my gosh. One of the reasons I love the Doshiguma armor was because of the bonus that it gave you after a successful offset or a successful clash. And so with offset, that's another opportunity to counter a monster, usually when they're being aggressive, and then all of a sudden you knock them back, sometimes you topple them, and then you're set up for inflicting a lot more damage. Same with clash. If you have a weapon that can block, time it right, and then all of a sudden what would be a dangerous charge ends up being neutralized, and then you're on the counterattack. So there's so many more tools for hunters to use now to deal with these monsters. So even though they're faster, even though they track better, hunters have gotten a lot better too. And then if you add the experience that you get after playing the game for a long time, then you end up with a game that feels a lot easier, just like Wilds does. That being said, I also understand why they try to make the base game easier, because that's basically your gateway into getting more players into the franchise. So it's not great if you're one of the people who want a challenge right off the bat, right? But at the same time, I still remember back in the day when Monster Hunter felt clunkier, it was a little bit harder to sort of get into it. And I know personally folks who I tried to introduce to the game who quit because they just couldn't figure it out. So I totally understand Capcom wanting to build the player base by making the game more accessible, by adding more quality of life stuff, and not making the monsters like so impossibly hard to beat. I totally get that. And I know from a business perspective you want that because you make more money, But at the same time, it's also good for the overall health of the franchise to have a bigger player base. And then eventually those new players end up becoming the experienced veterans who get better at the game and then maybe start complaining that the game is not difficult enough. It's like a never-ending cycle. But I also get that people get frustrated because they feel they're not being catered to and they think the game is being watered down. I totally understand where people are coming from. But having said that, I've always felt that the base games were easy. I don't ever remember a base Monster Hunter game being difficult, at least for me. And like I said, the exception would be the very first Monster Hunter game I played, which is Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. But I suspect a lot of the difficulties I had with that game was because I had no idea what I was doing. And so in short, after all that yap, is Monster Hunter Wilds easy, or does it feel easy? Yes, it does. Is it easier than past games? I guess you can make a case that it's easier than World, maybe even Rise. For me, it's kind of hard to judge, because I don't know if it's because I've played this game such a long time that I'm better at it compared to me in the past. Like, I was a veteran by the time 3U rolled in. Maybe I'm also a better player now than I was back then. Maybe I'm a better player now than I was back in World. Maybe I'm a better player now than I was in Rise, and that's why this felt easier than those other games. Although I don't know, there were some times in 3U where I was doing stuff that I don't know if I can do that now. I was younger and had better reflexes, so... But conceptually, I have a better understanding of Monster Hunter games. And so yes, Monster Hunter Wilds feels easier. Is that a problem? I'm not exactly sure. It's basically a balancing act between the health of the game and its player population, and then balancing that with the needs of its hardcore players. One thing I'm not worried about though, although there's a first time for everything, but I'm not worried about the expansion when Master Rank comes in, for example. Because every time, they've always provided monsters that were a nice challenge. And I apologize because I'm recovering from the flu and my voice is starting to go. But I guess that's the sign that I should end this video. So yes, Monster Hunter Wilds feels easier. For some, that will be a problem. For others, that's always how it's been. All I'll say is, hopefully, the game continues to grow, and they keep adding new monsters, and the Master Rank expansion provides the content that everybody wants. By then, hopefully, those who started with base Wilds have gotten their Monster Hunter cred built up, and then everybody is going to be ready for the harder content. I'm sure there are things I haven't addressed that I'll remember once this is done, but if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. Once again, this is Tabi Asobi. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all out there in Monster Hunter Wilds.